Good afternoon. Welcome back. We're going to start off with Dr. Amy Hawthorne's keynote this afternoon, followed by our last panel of the day. Amy is a Middle East expert with extensive policy, analytical, and practical experience on Arab political reform and democracy promotion. She is at the POMED project on Middle East democracy, leading the research at the organization. Prior to joining POMED in October 2015, Amy served as resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, where she's focused on U.S. policy toward Egypt and U.S. and European strategies to support political and economic reform in the post-2011 Arab world, with a concentration on Tunisia. Before joining the Atlantic Council in April 2013, Amy was an appointee at the U.S. Department of State for 2 years, where she helped to coordinate U.S. support for Egypt's transition and advise on the U.S. response to the Arab Spring. She previously served as a founding executive director of the Hollings Center for International Dialogue, a non-governmental organization operating in DC and in Istanbul, and promotes mutual understanding between the US and predominantly Muslim countries. She was also an associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she was the founding editor of the Arab Reform Bulletin, now publishing as SEDA outlet, and analyzed political reform in the Arab world. At the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, Amy was Senior Program Officer for Middle East, managing democracy programs across the Arab world. She has published a number of widely read analyses on US policy and democracy promotion in the Arab world, frequently is quoted in the media on these. Amy graduated with honors in history from Yale University with a focus on the Middle East, and obtained her MA in modern Middle Eastern studies at the University of Michigan. Again, we have Michigan here, where she concentrated on Islamic law. She has advanced skills in Arabic and has lived and traveled extensively throughout the Arab world, especially in Egypt as well as in Turkey. Please welcome Amy.
Good afternoon, everyone. When I'm giving the task of speaking about the prospects right now in the Arab world for transformation of Arab states into more open, pluralistic, inclusive, and even democratic polities, I admit to feeling quite daunted. For one thing, it's very hard to speak about the Arab world. This is an immensely complex region of some 300 million people across 16 countries and the Palestinian territories. There is significant diversity among Arab countries and within them. For another thing, this is without a doubt a very, very bleak time for the region, and it is not easy to be optimistic. What I would like to do this afternoon here with you today is speak in very broad strokes that necessarily gloss over important variations among countries and over local dynamics, and acknowledge the bleakness of the landscape, but also point to a few very small potential glimmers of hope. Then I want to mention what I see as the main challenges and opportunities almost 8 years after the earthquake that was the Arab uprisings, for those in the region who want to promote pluralism and inclusivity and democratic change, and finally mention a few lessons learned for the United States. So as I said, and as we all know, these are very dark days for pluralism, inclusion, and human rights across most of the region. The post-2011 civil wars in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, civil wars in which outside players are deeply involved, are ravaging these countries, tearing apart their social fabric, causing mass human suffering, destroying institutions, and creating very deep wounds that will take decades to heal. And of course, we have to keep in mind the much longer-running Israel-Palestine conflict that remains on a slow boil, but could erupt again at any time. And it's important to mention Syria, which is in a category of its own with regard to the sheer scale of the killing, destruction, and displacement that the Assad regime has caused. The damage done to Syrian society and to the principles of justice and accountability in the face of the failed regional and international response will be long-lasting. None of these wars, post-2011 wars, looks close to settlement, even though Syria is nearing, or appears to be nearing, a regime victory. And when these conflicts eventually do end, there's serious reason to doubt, especially in Syria, about whether the settlements that end them will involve the creation of more inclusive, accountable, and just political systems to address the profound governance problems that instigated these conflicts in the first place. Reimposing authoritarian systems or re-empowering the same corrupt elites may be the preferred quick fix approach of regional actors in the international community, even though it's painfully easy to see how this could just plant the seeds of renewed conflict down the road. Key external players appear to have little interest or little leverage or political will to press for outcomes that would address the underlying political causes that gave rise to these wars. Elsewhere, in the countries in the region that have more or less held together after 2011, with the exception of Tunisia, we see in broad strokes either dysfunctional pluralism, such as in Iraq or Lebanon, where identitarian politics create gridlock, polarization, and popular anger over failed governance, or renewed, and in some cases more vicious and aggressive, authoritarianism. In the strongmen states, such as Egypt, rulers are doubling down on repression, determined to maintain power by closing off all avenues for citizen-led political change. Some rulers are trying to carry out limited economic and social reforms that they hope will shore up the ruling systems and keep them in power. But most are doing this at the same time as they're tightening control and in some cases trying to quash or suppress politics altogether. The local dynamics, of course, in each country are distinct, but the general trend is toward increasingly securitized regimes, tightening controls on media and information technology, and the imposition of harsh punishments for those who dare to challenge the status quo. Many of these post-2011 regimes are trying to build or rebuild their legitimacy on claims of being necessary to avoid a Libya or Syria-like scenario by maintaining control, and in some cases, by fostering a new form of nationalism that is exclusionary, sectarian, and intolerant. And as we also know, the violent state breakdown, dysfunction, and even despair across the region has also given rise to virulently dangerous extremist groups whose goal is the violent creation of a totalitarian system that would eradicate all diversity and deny all human rights. Under these conditions, it is hardly surprising that many of the people who fought for democratic change before, during, and after the 2011 uprisings are fatigued, disillusioned, unsure of the way forward, if not in prison. Authoritarian regimes would appear to have the upper hand, pushing a narrative that peaceful dissent equals terrorism, and that demands for political change risk unleashing chaos. And among the broader publics, it must be said, apathy and cynicism and sometimes fear are prevalent. A third part of this dark picture at present is the indifference of Western governments toward, or in some cases their vocal support for, this authoritarian resurgence. Coming at a moment when Western democracy is under strain and advocates of liberal democracy worldwide are on the defensive, this Western indifference is creating an especially permissive international environment for Arab autocracy. With respect to the United States' role in particular, it is not a pretty picture. It's important to note that the main thrust of US policy under the Trump administration, which is generally we could summarize as support for authoritarian allies and for the autocratic status quo, is not such a break with the past as it might appear. For decades, the US has been deeply involved in the region, primarily as a military and counterterrorism actor, and as a security partner to undemocratic Arab allies. Trump's emphasis in many respects on this hard power is an intensification of this longstanding trend. What has changed, of course, is that there is now a far more open U.S. embrace of and doubling down on many Arab authoritarian allies, and the disappearance, at least, of any visible soft power agenda. As an Egyptian human rights activist aptly put it last year, in the past, she said, from her perspective, about 85% of U.S. policy in the Arab world was about supporting Arab regimes and focusing on security interests. But there was often a margin of about 15% where the United States would weigh in on the side of rights and freedom and civic activism, and in doing so, sometimes had a positive impact. In the Trump administration, we can say that that margin has virtually disappeared. The dominant view appears to be that repression inside Arab countries is irrelevant to U.S. interests, and that authoritarian rulers are ideal partners, and that the region is mainly a place for securing U.S. security interests and challenging Iran, full stop. Despite this very bleak picture, I don't believe that the struggle for rights and justice, for more inclusive and fair governing systems in Arab countries is over. I don't think the story is over, and I think there will be another chapter. And I say this because I believe that while democratization is never inevitable in any society, and democracy, as we're learning, can be surprisingly fragile even where it has existed for a long time, neither is authoritarianism and repression destined to be the permanent fate of any Arab country. Democratization is everywhere a long and contentious process, and it's a struggle with gains and reversals in which failures sometimes can lay the groundwork for future successes. The Arab security states are modern political structures, less than 100 years old. When thinking about the possibilities for the region, we need to be realistic, but we also need to avoid essentialism and historical determinism. So, acknowledging all the problems in the Arab world today, and setting aside the conflict countries, which are in a different situation entirely, I believe that with those countries, the most important goal is to end the fighting and stop the killing, and then the rebuilding and reconstruction of those societies poses a whole different, that's a topic for a whole other conference, of course. So putting aside those countries, across the rest of the region, I see three reasons, why all hope is not lost, and why a different trajectory could, and emphasis under could, emerge in the coming years. The first reason is that in most of the authoritarian countries, despite the resurgence of autocracy, discontent remains widespread. And even though it is rarely expressed these days in the form of mass politics, you just need to spend a little bit of time in these countries talking to ordinary people to see what the mood is actually really like in many of these places. And there are real questions about whether the incumbent regimes have any real responses to what is causing this discontent besides repression, and if repression can work indefinitely. None of the economic, social, and political problems that gave rise to the 2011 uprisings in these countries have gotten any better. And in some cases, in some countries, they've actually gotten worse. Unemployment, especially among young people, remains very high, and not just a lack of jobs, there's a lack of good quality jobs. Those jobs remain scarce. Cost of living keeps rising. Corruption in many of these countries remains endemic. Public services continue to deteriorate. Police routinely abuse citizens with impunity, and courts offer little justice. In nearly any one of these countries, as I mentioned, if you go beyond the thin layer of society that represents the regimes and their supporters, and talk to young people from all different social classes, they will tell you that they feel that like they're suffocating. And they see very little hope, very little future for themselves inside their countries, and if given the chance to emigrate, they would. And so to me, that is maybe one of the most damning indictments of how these regimes are actually doing. Of course, the specifics vary from country to country, but the heart of the problem is that the governing systems are not delivering what they should to citizens. And the old, well-known authoritarian bargain around which Arab security states have governed for decades and originally derived their legitimacy is under severe strain. And of course, this bargain was under strain before the uprisings, and this was one of the factors that gave rise to the unrest in the first place. But that strain, I think, has intensified in the past years in many of these countries. This bargain offered to a large number of citizens free or subsidized public service or goods, jobs with the state, and public security gained through tight control of the public sphere, in return, basically, simply put, for acquiescence to authoritarian rule and governance by a narrow clique. Today, most Arab governments are continuing to have to dismantle that social contract in the face of new or continuing or intensifying fiscal and social pressures and seriously underperforming economies. These leaders are cutting subsidies, trying to reduce bloated bureaucracies in which hiring people had served a role for absorbing popular discontent. They're raising taxes and prices, and they're talking about creating private sector jobs without really creating many. The discontent that this is generating, regimes are mainly dealing with through crackdown and co-optation. None of the leaders of the incumbent regimes, in my view, has any really clear vision for how to tackle the underlying problems that are giving rise to this dysfunction. And they're all, to one degree or another, basically papering over the growing crisis. I think mostly because they want to avoid the deeper reforms and restructuring that would be required for the overhaul that is actually needed. Take President el-Sisi of Egypt, for example. He knows how to cut the budget, slash subsidies, and launch mega projects. But he and the increasingly small group of military officials around him who are running the country have no apparent idea how to actually create jobs in the private sector, improve living standards, or address Egypt's mounting population, water, and climate change crises. Those Egyptians who do have ideas are excluded from input or influence. Now, I don't want to overstate the possibilities, the positive possibilities presented by this situation. As we know, repression can work, and it can work for a very long time. And Arab authoritarianism has shown itself to be very adaptable and very durable in the face of real pressures. But if you look at some of the long-term trends in the region that mostly have to do with economics and the economics of oil and declining revenues, there's a valid question about whether all of these regimes will be able to navigate through the situation simply by using repression and without opening up political space and expanding participation in order to build public support for the painful changes that they are implementing and need to implement. And even though if you talk to most people in the region, they would agree that with the exception of Tunisia, the uprisings, of course, were a failure. The 2011 uprisings were a failure. For some people in the region, that moment gave citizens a very brief glimpse, however brief, of how vulnerable their rulers were and how bankrupt so many of these regimes are, and of the possibility of a different future. So no matter how hard regimes and their supporters have tried to erase those memories, I think that with some people, the concept of an idea that things could be different remains alive in some people's minds. And the crisis of the Arab social contract, at a minimum, creates, if people are able to take advantage of it, creates an opening for people to make a strong case about the failure of the current systems, the need for change, and for alternative approaches. And excluding, for countries that don't want to listen to this, I'm not sure, and it's an open question, whether managing this process through excluding citizens from decision-making, from participation, forcing them to accept top-down decisions, and making significant economic and social changes while relying on foreign advisors may not be a recipe for success. A second very, very small glimmer of hope is that even after the failure of most of the uprisings, there are still some people across the region, especially young people, not the discredited old opposition elite, who are still committed to creating more open and just and better functioning societies. For the most part, against all odds, and often taking huge risks, these people are still struggling on behalf of change, and not all of them have given up. And you can see hints of this in the protests against deteriorating living standards, injustice, and corrupt leadership that regularly take place across the region, even still today. And if you look closely, you can see it in the use of literature, arts, culture, and humor to express dissent. You can also see it in civic groups that are working to improve economic policy and education, pressing for budget transparency and access to information, exposing regimes' human rights violations, working to free political prisoners, combating violence against women, fighting environmental destruction and pollution. Some of this work is very innovative. Much of it is local and practical, and building human and political capital on a small scale and working within whatever space is available. To be sure, the obstacles facing these initiatives are huge. Progress is very slow, and the size and influence of these people and their civic initiatives is very limited. They are a minority in a body politic that is dominated by apathy or by liberalism. But what I'm trying to point out to you is that they do exist, and they offer something positive that can be built on. The third reason for hope is the experience of democratizing Tunisia. In many respects, Tunisia is a singular experience, a regional outlier, and not a model that can simply be replicated elsewhere in countries that are quite different and have whole different sets of challenges than Tunisia has. But it's also important to keep in mind that Tunisia is dealing with a lot of the same economic, security, and political challenges as a lot of other countries. But the difference is that they're trying to do so within a pluralistic, inclusive, and democratic system, which I actually think gives them a better chance of success. There's a lot of dysfunction in Tunisia, plenty of problems, and if you're just in the country for a few hours, you can feel the disappointment and frustration among a lot of Tunisians about what's happening. But almost 8 years later, the experiment is still going. It has not gone off the rails yet. And all things considered, Tunisia is actually not faring too badly. So Tunisia, in my view, stands as an example that democratization in this region is possible, that in the post-2011 Arab world, a free country that respects rights and pluralism and has an inclusive governing system is a reality. Tunisia on its own is not going to transform its neighbors or other countries in the region, but its existence and the existence of this example destroys the argument that authoritarianism is the only option for Arab countries. Now, for those in the region who believe in pluralism and rights and civic empowerment and more inclusive political systems, this difficult time offers an opportunity to reflect on what went wrong during and after 2011, to think through what they might do differently in the future, and to lay the groundwork for a future opening if and when it comes in their countries. And to be sure, as many scholars have written since 2011, there are very important structural factors in Arab political and economic systems that have represented significant impediments to democratic change. And those factors are not going to change quickly. If in some countries it might be difficult to change at all. But I believe that there's also some room in this picture for human agency in shaping what happens. That what political actors do and what strategies they use and choices they make does matter. With this in mind, and acknowledging how different the conditions on the ground are in Arab countries, let me just mention a few of the really hard questions that some people in the region who are committed to more open and pluralistic societies should be asking. And some people I know in the region are already asking these questions and already working on them. The first question is, what is the most important lesson from 2011, from the uprisings, about authoritarian regime durability that can be applied in a future political opening? We know that authoritarianism in this region is very persistent, even when faced with mass popular uprisings. So what lessons can be learned about what happened in 2011 and how durable and strong certain authoritarian institutions are that could be applied in the future? A second question is, how do pro-democracy people in this region build not just a strong critique of the status quo, but actually a coherent alternative political and economic vision that can explain in very simple terms to their fellow citizens why democratic change would make their lives better? What is their vision of a new social contract, a different economic system, better human security, human capital, and an approach that would replace the current frayed authoritarian bargain, and how would this be brought into existence? Another question is how people advocating such visions are going to build or expand the constituencies. How are they going to communicate their ideas and build support among their fellow citizens? I think this is a critical question, and I say that, keeping in mind the very difficult operating systems in these countries, but there are ways to spread ideas and mobilize people. And how do these actors build political coalitions across factions that can mobilize support and withstand regime pressure and divide and conquer tactics? Are there any core principles that these different actors from different political strands and streams can agree on? And the challenge of Islamist-secular cooperation is particularly acute and difficult in this regard. There is a great amount of deep mutual mistrust. But given the reality that mainstream Islamist movements, although they are on their back feet now, still have a constituency and are unlikely to disappear, I think it's very important that secular actors in the region figure out how to engage with these groups and use this time to have some very, very difficult and painful and honest conversations, if they're willing and able to do so, about cooperation in the past and in the future. And I can assure you that some of these conversations are actually already taking place. And a final question that these actors can be asking themselves is, within the space that's available, the space that's presented, what strategies can they develop to use what are sometimes, considered soft issues of women's rights and entrepreneurship as opportunities to actually build up leadership and political organizing skills and political capital? And I would just say there, I think there's a huge opportunity with the movement for women's rights if it's approached in certain ways. There are also some important lessons the United States should learn from 2011 and how the US responded, some of which draws on my experience from working in the Obama administration during that time, 2011 and 2012. The first is the US should not stake its interests on a single leader or group. The second is this is such a truism, but when thinking about elections, don't minimize their importance, but take into account how at times they can actually worsen conflict, not resolve it. And also be mindful of the presence of deeper authoritarian structures and systems, even as political democratic change appears to be occurring on the surface, and how hard these systems can be to dismantle, and how the fostering of more inclusive systems takes a very long time. And also, and this is particularly with regard to Egypt, to bear in mind that security agencies and militaries are very powerful political actors. They are not bystanders in the process. They have their own preferences and will act powerfully to impose them. And now that seems very obvious, but at the time, I'm not sure that all policymakers understood the Egyptian military's in 2011 and 2012, its own institutional interests and what it would be willing to do to advance them. On the economic front, I think the U.S., what the U.S. is recommending for the region then and now today is basically about reforms that will shrink the public sector and increase the private sector. There's still, I see among U.S. officials, a belief in focusing on aggregate GDP growth. But I think one of the most important lessons from the years leading up to the uprisings is that these figures have very little to do with the real economy and people's lived experiences. And I think that the US, it's also a lesson that could be learned is that the recommendation of the Washington Consensus, for example, the IMF and the World Bank, actually is very much debated and contested within a lot of these countries, and there's a lack of real public support for these reforms. The US also needs to seriously rethink the kind of assistance that it provides, especially with regard to democracy assistance in this region, if it is to try to become a player in that space again. There's a valid skepticism among a lot of US officials that democracy aid actually works and has any impact. But I would also say there's a real lack of clear picture of what does work, and a lack of understanding about how a lot of US economic and democracy assistance programs have played out on the ground. So there's a lot of room for understanding and evaluation there. And finally, and this is the most obvious point, I would say that the US should always be questioning the assumption and the narrative of authoritarian stability, which sometimes can really be an illusion. Now, I think we can safely say that the current US administration does not have much interest in reflecting on these lessons. I think the key players in the US government now, it seems, drew very different lessons from the Arab Spring. The main one being that authoritarian regimes are not the problem, but they are probably the solution to the region's problem, to the region's challenges. Of course, I believe that this is an erroneous approach, but it probably will take major changes in the region and also major changes here in our politics to cause a rethinking of that approach. So I pose these lessons learned for the US administration, mindful of the fact that it is unlikely that they will be taking them up anytime soon. And let me just close with some, I think, salient words from Marwan Washer, who's an important Arab thinker who spent a lot of time thinking about the questions of inclusivity and pluralism. And he wrote that, quote, "A commitment to pluralism in the Arab world is not by any means a sufficient condition to ensure stability and prosperity. But it is a necessary first step to place countries on the right track and to achieving these fundamental aims." Thank you very much.
So women as religious authorities, what a forgotten history means for the modern Middle East. Although the history of Islam attests to numerous examples of women transmitting hadith, so the sayings of the Prophet, writing authoritative scholarly commentaries on the Quran and religious law, and issuing fatwas, women are rarely found in these roles today. Most Muslim countries do not allow women to serve as judges in Islamic courts, and few congregations will invite women to lead in prayer, deliver the sermon, the khutbah, or turn to women's advice on matters of Islamic law. In the face of the dearth of women exercising Islamic authority, one might be forgiven for assuming that this must have been the case always, that for most of Islamic history, women had no business in gaining expertise on questions of religion and religious law, and that these realms of knowledge were the near-exclusive domain of men. Yet, a look into Islamic history suggests otherwise. In the early periods of Islam, women had great prominence in transmitting the hadith, and the female family members of the Prophet were frequently consulted on questions of Islamic guidance. This practice did not remain limited to the Prophet's family and the descendants of his family. As a scholar of Islam, Khalid Abu al-Fadl notes, certain families from Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad made a virtual tradition of training female narrators. And these female scholars regularly trained and certified male and female jurists, and therefore played a major contributing role in the preservation and transmission of Islamic traditions. In his overview of the history of women as hadith scholars, the Oxford scholar Muhammad Akram Nadwi observes that in the formative period of Islam, women scholars are not only great in number, but also great in their authority. Men go to them to learn, and doing so is normal. Irene Schneider and Jonathan Berkey have shown that Nadwi's observations were not only true for the formative period of Islam. In later centuries too, we find that the great scholars of Islam learned not only from male, but also from female teachers. knowledge seekers traveled far and wide from Damascus and Cairo to Baghdad and Nishapur to study with female jurists. I'm going to mention a few names here, so those of you in Islamic studies will care, and for the others, you will notice that it's just 5 names and I won't return to them. The 12th century Sunni scholar Ibn Asakir, so he died in the 12th century, notes that he studied under 80 different female scholars. Among the 172 teachers of al-Subki, 19 were women. The Shafi scholar Ibn Ajar al-Asqalani names 53 women with whom he studied. Al-Sakhawi notes that he learned from 68 women, and Al-Suyuti lists 33 women among the 130 scholars on whose authority he recited traditions. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, a leading Hanbali jurist known for his stern approach to gender relations, lists 2 women among his teachers. Not only were women prevalent among the important group of hadith transmitters, they also issued fatwas, recommendations of behavior on the basis of Islamic law, a service only the most distinguished scholars of Islamic law would be requested to do. Careful reading of biographical dictionaries reveals a large number of women who are described as jurists, so faqihat, and who are asserted to have attained a level of competence that qualified them to issue fatwas. Among the earliest known examples is that of the Damascene jurist Hujayma bint Huyayr al-Atabiya, who died in 701, who is said to have taught numerous men and who enjoyed the confidence of the Caliph al-Malik bin Marwan, who sat with her regularly in the back of the Damascus mosque to debate issues of Islamic law. Can you imagine? Examples abound throughout the following centuries and are not confined to a particular center of learning or a particular madhab, so not confined to a particular school of jurisprudence. Women jurists can be found from Timbuktu to Cairo, from Damascus to Baghdad, from Isfahan to Nishapur, from the 700s to the 1500s, and across the Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi, and Shiite schools of law. Nor is there evidence that women transmitted or taught only gender-specific issues. The Shafi jurist, Amina bint al-Husayni al-Mahamili, was particularly expert in the law of inheritance. The Hanbali jurist Fatima bint Abbas al-Baghdadiyya became a renowned scholar of the Quran, and her contemporary, the great Islamic scholar, again Ibn Taymiyyah, whom I already mentioned, acknowledged her as equal in knowledge and expertise to himself. Another example is Aisha al-Bawniya, who excelled in Arabic grammar and rhetoric, Islamic law, theology, and mysticism. Now, with the rise of modernity, the profound transformations in statecraft, the adoption of European legal systems, the diminished role of religious authorities across the Muslim world, and the rise of political Islam, the memory of these multifaceted ways in which women were central to the development of the Islamic tradition, Islamic law, and scholarship moved into the distance. It's not entirely clear why in modernity religious authority in Islam was in most places reshaped to include men only, why it was forgotten that women too could become muftis, and that their interpretations should not only have authority for female believers but also male. While modern educational systems that focused on men's preparations to be later breadwinners played a role, as well as the militant anti-colonial struggles that propelled men to political leadership positions and relegated women to the private sphere, the reasons are multifaceted and vary across the Muslim world. Still, the schism between the 7th to 6th century on the one hand and the 17th to 20th century on the other is extraordinary. In a sense, one can speak of a modern abyss for female religious authority. Women Islamic scholars, muftis, judges are the great exception in this period. Even public opinion surveys, and we've actually done a survey in the context of the Carnegie project, indicate that most believers today, irrespective of gender, do not wish to follow women religious leaders and do not trust a woman's interpretation of the Quran, even if she is proven to be equally qualified. Fortunately, several recent developments indicate that the tables may be turning once again. In 2000, I'm going to speak about some of the new initiatives that create a new situation. In 2006, the Moroccan state began to train female religious counselors, so-called mushidat, to be assigned to mosques around the country with the task of responding to religious inquiries. The main role of these counselors is to provide legal guidance to women so that female believers are not compelled to consult men on health and women-specific issues. The program has since grown and become very popular, with hundreds of women being trained as murshidat now every year. In Syria, prior to the war, female graduates of Islamic law colleges were being trained to become assistant muftis, able to offer gender-specific advice to women. The Grand Mufti at the time also announced that he would appoint a woman to the Fatwa Council in Damascus. The Turkish Directorate of Religious Affairs, the Diyanet, has since 2005 appointed female assistant muftis who may issue fatwas on women's issues. It has also, since 2006, certified hundreds of women as Bayan Vaiselar, that is, Diyanet personnel who give lessons at the mosque 3 times a week and may lead pilgrims to Mecca. The Diyanet has also more recently begun to send female Vaiselar abroad to mosques in Europe and Asia that are funded by the Turkish government. Currently, there are 13 female Vaiselar in Germany, for example, at mosques administered by the Foreign Office of the Diyanet. Now, Iran, the final example I'll give, has been the most proactive in training women as religious authorities, and much of my work has consisted of fieldwork among the religious seminaries in Iran. Since the 1990s, hundreds of religious seminaries have been set up across the country that train women in Islamic sciences. It is estimated that 40,000 female students presently study in the theological seminaries of Iran. Similar to the Moroccan program, they are not trained to become scholars of Islamic law, which might prompt them to generate reinterpretations of Islamic law, but to give lessons at mosques and schools, to respond to female believers' inquiries, and to lead pilgrims to Mecca and other holy sites. In most of these recent initiatives, then, women are trained to respond to the inquiries of female believers only, not as authorities for the Ummah as such. The Turkish and pre-war Syrian programs train women to issue fatwas, but they do so only with regard to women's issues and in response to women's inquiries. This is remarkably despite the fact that all 4 Sunni schools of law, as well as the Tolba Shia school, recognize the eligibility of women to serve as muftis not only in issues of particular relevance or interest to women, but on any issue a believer might seek advice on. I really want to stress that because, of course, many of these programs are justified with reference to Islamic law, but Islamic law is much more permissive. The consensus in all 4 Sunni schools and the Tolba Shia school is that women could be muftis with regard to all issues and also in response to male believers, not only women. Ahmed al-Haddad, the Grand Mufti of Dubai, who also heads the State Department of Islamic Affairs and Charitable Activities, in 2009 issued this important reminder to his audience. It's a longer quote, but I think it's marvelous. I will read it out. In many Muslim countries, women are already involved with the issuing of fatwas or legal rulings, but frequently these are confined to female issues. However, a woman who is learned and trained in issuing fatwas is not limited in her role to issuing fatwas that relate to women only, but rather she is qualified to issue on matters of worship, jurisprudence, morality, and behavior. Al-Haddad went on to say that Islamic tradition was, quote, rich in examples of the highly learned women acting as muftis and issuing decrees on all matters, and added that women too can order acts of virtue and ban acts of vice. We just had these same key phrases here with regard to Saudi Arabia earlier. So order acts of virtue and ban acts of vice just like a man can, which is what female contemporaries of the Prophet have done, as well as the women who came after them. I think this quote is so marvelous because he is really the only leader I'm aware of who has articulated this so clearly, that women should be able to issue advice on any matter, and that there's also a long history, not only among the Prophet's family, but a long tradition since. In this, Al-Haddad is entirely right. It is time for women to reclaim their historical role and for believers to remember that for centuries Islamic authority was less gender inclusive than for much of the modern era. Training more women in the interpretation of Islamic sources does not mean that such interpretations will overnight become more inclusive or more gender sensitive. But educating young women about the role models in the Islamic tradition, the women teachers of Ibn Taymiyyah, or the Damascene jurist Al-Atabiyya, whom the Caliph consulted on legal and political questions, is incredibly important. We all know how seeing someone like us in a leadership position can completely change our own aspirations, can open up new horizons and career goals previously not considered. Many Muslims are familiar with the pivotal role played by Aisha and Fatima, but these were women of the Prophet's family and as such beyond reach. In a way, their towering image is part of the problem, as it elevates the example of female religious authority to unreachable heights. Instead, the image of women's religious authority needs to be normalized once again. Generations of women from the 7th to the 18th century have sought Islamic knowledge and qualified themselves as jurists, hadith transmitters, and scholars of Islam, to whom male students would travel across the Muslim world. Memories need to be reactivated to show that the women of the Prophet's family were precisely not unique in taking on religious leadership roles, but that many across the centuries emulated their model and contributed to a strong tradition of female Islamic authority, which is probably stronger comparatively than in any of the other Abrahamic religions. So how can this be achieved? How can women's religious authority in Islam be re-normalized? Are there specific policy recommendations that can be formulated? Obviously, changes in perceptions need to come from within. If women should be trained as religious authorities in all matters and for all believers, not only women, then the attitudes towards women in religious leadership positions need to change by educators, by applicants to educational institutions, and also the general public. Religious leaders are only leaders if they have a following, and women muftis have reflected on this repeatedly. An important arena in the realm of changing perceptions is memory making, and I'm coming to the end. Memory making by sponsoring programs in popular culture that revive the tradition of women jurists in Islam, for example, by supporting visual culture projects such as the production of cartoons, videos, and films about such women. In fact, some Iranian NGOs are engaged in precisely that. Or by generating exhibitions, children's books, games, toys that elevate the memory of outstanding women jurists and hadith transmitters. Also, by supporting local research on examples of women religious leaders, to introduce them into realms of common knowledge. In short, to promote pluralism and inclusive policies by reactivating the memory of more pluralistic pasts.